For my project, I explored Communist China's copying of Soviet art through a genre called Socialist Realism. They copied this, among other things, from the Soviets in an effort to modernize and make a wholehearted switch to socialist policies and lifestyle. But much like their new economic and political system, the artistic culture they attempted to adopt was foreign. The result was decades of this socialist realist art which was devoid of creativity and passion, stripped of individuality, and made solely for the purpose of pleasing an oppressive regime. Socialist realism was an artistic genre that began in the Soviet Union. It was inspired by a few famous Russian painters from before the revolution, like Ilya Repin. But the style as socialist realism was developed in Soviet art schools between 1928 and 1934. It became the official model for all artwork in 1934. The idea behind it was art for a purpose, but art that was for everyone. So the genre was made to extend to all of the arts, including literature, dance, and drama. This means that the genre is not bound by style, it's all about theme and content. So what makes something socialist realist? To paraphrase Stalin, socialism is the truth and it is the future. If art contains socialist ideals displayed in a positive way, then the art is socialist realism. But it isn't quite that simple. In socialist realism, there is a focus on the proletariat, meaning the working class. These were the people that the revolution was all about, so they should be the main focus of the art. Socialist realism was to honor those who selflessly and heroically gave their lives to the cause, some figuratively and some literally. These were the people that were the perfect socialist men and women, because these everyday people placed the collective good of society over their own personal well-being. The example shown is a portrait by Ilya Repin titled A Shy Peasant, completed in 1877. The Chinese painting, Standing Guard for Our Great Motherland, fits the same criteria. Another vital aspect of socialist realism was history painting. This was a somewhat deceptive name, as Soviet painters were instructed to paint history as it ought to be remembered, instead of precisely how it happened. Russian art scholar W. Bruce Lincoln named some of the characteristics of this, including the inflation of minor accomplishments and victories, overlooking major failures, only showing the Russians suffering under the oppressive bourgeois regime of the Tsars, and giving godlike praise to Lenin and Stalin for pulling the people out of this suffering. The example shown is a painting by Isak Brodsky titled 26 Baku Commissars. This 1964 painting, entitled Sons of Poor Peasants, is a Chinese example of the same idea. Lastly, there's the cult of Stalin. These socialist realist paintings focused on Stalin as this godlike hero. They glorify Stalin as the embodiment of all virtues that the Communist Party praised. Some paintings show him working hard or facing oppression in his past, guiding and teaching lower government officials, meeting with workers and peasants, and sometimes working with Lenin or Marx, as a way to show that he was the legitimate successor to Lenin. While people originally started painting Stalin because it was safe or it would help them to get more art supplies and possibly praise, this cult of Stalin became a quasi-religious aspect of Soviet culture. Pictured here is a painting by Alexander Gerasimov, a well-known painter who specialized in these cult of Stalin portraits. This one is called Stalin and Voroshilov in the Kremlin After the Rain, painted in 1938. Socialist realism comes to China. 7 years before the People's Republic of China was established, Mao gave speeches in Yunnan that were pivotal in deciding the role of art and the type of art accepted in the future nation. Take note of the audience in the painting. Most people are recording Mao's every word in a small notebook. This was not fabricated for the sake of this painting. Many of Mao's early followers treated him like a prophet, recording the things that he said and committing them to memory so that they could be a perfect communist like Mao. Mao attacked the artist for being elitist by having subjects in their art that were neither relatable nor available to the working class. He also claimed that all art has a purpose, because all art is political in some way. He encouraged people to use art as a weapon. In one of these speeches, Mao lays out what makes art acceptable. He said, Utilize only the subject of the present time and struggles. Apply present ideals, and determine what is important enough to become memorialized within the art using a Marxist framework. This is also the description of socialist realism. Fast forward to 1951. The People's Republic of China is 2 years old and is still in a transitional state. Soviets began to criticize the Chinese in several art publications for their lack of artistic reforms. The Soviets mocked the Chinese for creating mainly black and white landscapes in ink, a tradition rooted in Confucianism that dated back to the Ming Dynasty. Embarrassed and offended, artists and professors from across the nation traveled to Leningrad to look at their superior art and fell in love. Upon their return, 25 Chinese art students were sent to the Soviet capital for a 3-year course in oil painting. Zhang Feng, head of the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing, immediately began to change his curriculum, adding oil paint and advocating that other academies do so as well. The Chinese Ministry of Culture imported Soviet painter Konstantin Maximov from Moscow in February of 1955. He was tasked with teaching a 2-year postgraduate course at the Central Academy for Fine Arts in Beijing. The class would comprise of 21 of the best students from different art schools across the nation. The students were mainly instructed in oil painting and the use of color. In the book Painters and Politics in the People's Republic of China, it declares that Maximov's instruction on the use of color was his greatest contribution to Chinese art. He encouraged students to use their experiences to create more unique subjects for their art and find a way to make that fit together with their talents, whether that be landscapes or figure drawing. In an effort to help spread the superior Soviet style, some of Maximov's lectures were made available to the public, and people traveled far and wide to watch the master at work. He helped the institution to create a standardized curriculum modeled after that of similar Soviet institutions. This remained long after Maximov had returned to the Soviet Union. Maximov was given a lot of freedom at the academy. In a 2002 interview, one of his former students claimed that he had been introduced to the works of several Western artists by Maximov, something that doesn't seem like it would be well tolerated by the Soviets or the CCP. But the Chinese turned a blind eye to it, because the Soviets and their superior culture could do no wrong. There was one criticism of Maximov that struck me when addressed by Julia Andrews, a professor and art historian at The Ohio State University. She noted that creativity had little place in this system. The system that she is referring to is socialist realism, and this is absolutely true. Artists had to follow a strict formula that provided them with few subjects to choose from. They had to make sure everything looked somewhat realistic, with minimal stylistic or artistic personality. As you can see, Maximov had a particular style. He painted with large, blocky, and visible brush strokes, while sometimes using a softer technique to create details like facial features. Many of his students used a very similar color palette and the same technique with harsh, visible brush strokes. This is something attributed to an individual style, but some of the students mistook it for an element of socialist realism and thus tried to copy the harsh brush strokes on their own paintings. These 3 paintings are examples of the work of 3 different students in the Maximov class. All 3 of these paintings display characteristics of socialist realism painting, and a major influence from Maximov. This influence is then visible secondhand, as many of his students became art instructors, and a few even became heads of some of China's most prestigious art institutions in the 1980s. The 1957 100 Flowers campaign encouraged men and women of the party to criticize the administration, the party, and anything else they disliked. The idea was that criticism from the public would help to strengthen the government through communist solutions and discussion. Instead, the campaign was used to single out rightists, or people who held on to capitalist ideals. Those given this label were publicly mocked, stripped of party membership, and sometimes sent to a prison camp to be re-educated through hard labor. Zhang Feng, the head of CAFA, was arrested and placed in a labor camp, causing several students and faculty members to organize a protest in his honor. But the government cracked down on his defenders, labeling everyone involved as a rightist. In 1960, tension between the USSR and China had been mounting for several years through the period of de-Stalinization, which Mao vocally disapproved of. But when Khrushchev criticized Mao's Great Leap Forward, the Sino-Soviet tensions came to a head. This propaganda poster says, "Unite to overthrow Soviet revisionism," a direct jab at Khrushchev. The Soviet Union pulled all Soviet government employees out of China. Following the Sino-Soviet split, there was a movement to Sinicize oil painting, or at least discontinue the use of Soviet methods. But it was half-hearted and not much changed. This period in the late 50s and early 60s could have had the potential to foster great reforms in the arts, with the loss of influential art academy leadership and the condemnation of all things Soviet. However, cultural growth and reform were put on hold as the country became immersed in the world's largest man-made famine, which killed nearly 20 million people. This national crisis leads to a more relaxed cultural atmosphere, with authorities paying far less attention to the arts and more attention to keeping the nation alive, but less artistic culture because people are more concerned with staying alive than creating art. The goal of the Great Leap Forward was rapid industrialization and collectivization. It was loosely inspired by Stalin's 5-year plans, most of which were also complete disasters. 1966 marked the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, with Mao's call to the young people of China, calling itself the Red Guard. He asked them to take action against anything that was not conducive to communism. They obliged by destroying thousands of years' worth of art, literature, and pieces of Chinese culture. Shown here is one of the most famous pieces of Red Guard propaganda, which explicitly asks the Chinese to destroy all religious icons and other things remaining from the imperial times. It was during this period of revolution that art truly became accessible to the people, but only due to the idea that propaganda posters could be fine art. So despite all the original proponents of socialist realism having been purged from their influential posts, the artistic genre continued successfully in China. But the art became less and less like real fine art. Some of the pictures had a moral, like this, aptly titled, "Chairman Mao's Red Guard, Learn from the Model of Revolutionary Youth." Oil-painted portraits of Mao were reproduced and mass-distributed as posters and buttons that nearly every family owned, showing an emerging cult of Mao. Propaganda posters inspired by socialist realist ideas were everywhere, highlighting the importance of every man, woman, and child to the progress of the revolution. The picture on the left is titled, "I Must Become This Kind of Person," which shows a little girl clutching her little red book of quotes from Chairman Mao. The picture on the right is called "Go Among the Workers, Peasants, and Soldiers, and Into the Thick of Struggle." Everything about this art movement was contrived. The book, The Chinese Cultural Revolution, suggests that any power these images may have had in the beginning was quickly exhausted by the excessive reproduction and overuse of similar themes. Everything was the same. To an extent, the party had achieved its goal of creating a new culture. But this new culture was brainwashed, afraid to have opinions, and banned from many forms of self-expression. Much of this culture was based on pieces of other cultures that didn't necessarily fit together. The nation was attempting to fit the ideas of German philosopher Karl Marx with the paranoid views of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, all in the context of a Chinese culture that had been developing for thousands of years. The ideas did not fit together to create a cohesive society, and when China could no longer depend on the Soviets for help, the arts became devastated.